Okay, everyone, today's lesson is going to cover everything about angles. We're going to talk about supplementary angles today. We're going to talk about complementary angles. We're going to talk about vertical and adjacent. So by the end of this video, we'll have covered a lot of ground here, but you should be able to tell the difference between supplementary and complementary angles and kind of know how many degrees they equal, what vertical angles are, what adjacent angles are. So we should have a pretty good idea of what all those angles are. They're not terribly tricky, but you should be able to figure it out. So let's start off with supplementary angles. Now, supplementary angles are two angles that have a sum. Now, sum means that you're adding, right? You're going to add those numbers up. When you add them up, they make 180. So for instance, I mean, this is not very difficult, but 100 plus 80 is 180. Those are supplementary angles. You could say 150 plus 30. Those are supplementary. So as long as they add up to 180, they don't even have to be whole numbers either. I mean, you could have 179.5 plus 0.5. That will equal 180 degrees. But two angles that have a sum of 180 are considered supplementary. Now, our first couple examples here just kind of involve basic arithmetic. And so when we solve this, we can set up an equation. X plus 35 is equal to 180. And then you're going to take away 35 from both sides. And then what do you get? You get x is equal to 145 degrees. I think I might have said this in a previous lesson, but yet for these kind of problems too, you might want to put away your protractor, because some people say, well, you know what, I'm on D, Mr. Oliver, I'm just going to measure it with my protractor, forget all this algebra, and that's how I'm going to figure it out. But don't always rely on that. Base it on the information that you're given. So if that angle right there is 35, this one has to be 145. Even though that when you measure it with your protractor, maybe you get like 130 or something. Maybe it's not exactly 145. Like I said, not all math books, not all the examples make the angles exactly what they say they are, because they want you to rely on what the math is. Same thing for number 2. We're going to set up a real simple equation for that one. X plus 65 is equal to 180. Take away 65 from both sides, and you get x is equal to 115 degrees. That's right there. So the first couple questions right there are pretty straightforward. Okay, moving on to number 3 right here. Now this one involves a little bit of algebra, but again, we just can fall back on what the definition of supplementary is. And supplementary states that there are two angles that have a sum, meaning they add. That means they add up to 180 degrees. So my first angle is 7x plus 10, and our second angle is 3x. And it's a sum, right? So that means we're going to add. And what are we going to make that equal to? We're going to make it equal to 180 degrees. So 7x plus 3x, when we add that up, we're going to get 10x. Don't add 7 and 10x and get 17. All right, now I could divide by 10 or I could subtract 10. I want to, and you want to, subtract 10 first, then divide last. So we're going to divide 10 into both sides. What you do to one side, you do to the other. And then what we're left with after that is 10x equals 170. All right, and the last step is going to be dividing by 10. Now those cancel out right there, and then you're left with x equals 17. All right, and that's all we had to do for that problem was, it said find x. Find x, but let's, sometimes it's going to say find x and tell me what the measurements of those angles are. So let's go ahead and do that. There's nothing that says we don't have to do that, so let's do it. So we're going to put in, wherever we see an x, we're going to put in 17. All right, so I got 129 for that angle right there, and I'm going to do 3 times 17 for this one. And when we do that, 3 times 17 is 51. So 129 and 51. If you're curious, does 129 plus 51 equal 180? It does, and that's a kind of a good way to kind of check yourself to see if you're doing those right, and that does work. But again, like I said, we just had to figure out x, but sometimes it's going to ask you what's the angle measurement as well, so we have to put that number in. All right, now moving on to complementary angles, but two angles that have a sum of exactly 90 degrees. One thing that, sometimes I mention this in class, is sometimes students are really clever with ways that they remember things. And I think one of the things that is always commonly confused is they will switch up or they'll mix up what complementary is and supplementary. So some people come up to me and say, well, is supplementary 90 or is it 180, or is complementary 90 and 180. They're not sure because they sound very similar to each other. And it's not like you're a math teacher where you just have all this kind of committed to memory. You know, I've had like some students, they've told me, well, complementary begins with a C and supplementary begins with an S. So one way to think of that is, well, C comes before S in the alphabet. So that's a lower value. So complementary is 90 degrees and supplementary is 180. So I've seen that. I've also had students in the past that have said, you know what, a C kind of, I mean, you really have to kind of stretch your imagination here, but kind of looks like a 9 if you do that, you know, so like 90 degrees. And then they have said that, well, and that's complementary, of course. And they'll say, well, the S kind of, sort of, again, you have to stretch your imagination a little bit, kind of looks like an 8 if you do that. And then you get 180, and that's supplementary. So those are ways that you can kind of remember what they are. You know, some people are just like, I just know what they are, and that's fine. All right, so the first example here, find the complement of 31 degrees. So we do x plus 31, and then make that equal to 90. So we're going to solve that equation by taking 31 away from both sides of the equation. You get x equals 59 degrees. And just like I was saying before, don't get out your protractors on these. Base this on the information that we have. We have that angle is 31, and we know that they're complementary. And I didn't say this earlier, but there's a box in this corner. I think I might have said this in a previous lesson, but that box represents a right angle. You know, so if you see that right angle there, we know that that's 90 degrees without actually a 90 written in there. That's like the universal symbol for that, meaning that it's a 90-degree angle. It's a right angle. So 31 plus 59, though, does equal 90. Like I said, some people will get out their protractors and measure it and say, well, you know what, it's really 62 degrees. Or they'll say it's really 75 degrees. And I'll say, yeah, maybe actually you're right on your protractor, it is. But according to the information that we have been given, we have to kind of go with that. All right, for example 5, just like we did for the supplementary angles, we're just going to kind of set up some algebra here. So it doesn't really matter the order in which you do it. 4x plus 3 plus the other angle, x minus 9, or x minus 8, equals 90, because we know that those are complementary. How do we know that they're complementary? Well, we're on the complementary section of our notes, but there's a square in that corner right there that represents 90 degrees for sure. Okay, so let's remember what we do with like terms. We cannot do 4x plus 3. Those are not like terms. But I can add x's to other x's. So 4x plus, and you could think of that as 1x. So 4x plus 1x is 5x. And then constants, this is 3 and this is negative 8. Well, 3 and negative 8 will make minus 5. And then I'm going to make that equal to 90. And now we have a basic two-step equation that we need to solve right there. So what do we do first? Do we divide by 5 or do we add 5? That is correct. We're going to add 5 to both sides. What you do to one side, you do to the other. Rewrite the equation. So now you got 5x equals 95. And then divide both sides by 5. So then we get x is equal to 19. And that's it. And like I said on the last problem too, if the exercise here was to find x, we're done. But if the point was to figure out what the angle measurements were, then we could just put those numbers in for x as well and see what we get. Okay, for this next part, why don't you go ahead and just pause the video and just rattle these off on your own. And all you have to do is tell whether the angles are complementary, supplementary, or maybe they're neither. In case you're wondering, they're complementary, you know that they add up to 90 degrees. You know they're supplementary if they add up to 180 degrees. And we know that they're neither if they don't add up to one of those numbers. So go ahead and pause the video and just go through those quickly and just see how your answers match up. Okay, example 6, you should have ended up with complementary because they added up to exactly 90 degrees. 56 plus 34 is exactly 90. Number 7, you should have ended up with neither because 20, even though that's over 180, that doesn't matter. It has to be exactly 180 or it has to be exactly 90. It can't just be something close. So that would be neither. Number 8 is supplementary because those two numbers, 155 plus 25, adds up to exactly 180. Number 9 was a neither because 67 and 33 adds up to 100. And 100, even though that's close to 90, that's not close enough. It's got to be exactly 90. So that's neither. And example 10 is supplementary. Okay, now moving on to vertical angles and adjacent angles. Let's talk about vertical angles first. And for vertical angles, I've got two angles that, all right, now there's three things. Then The first thing is it says it shares a vertex, and that's where vertical angles get their name. Vertical angles, I think if you know what the word vertical means, some people think, well, vertical means just up and down. But that's not what vertical angles mean. It does not have anything to do with up and down. Vertical angles have to do with the fact that they share a vertex. Now, the vertex of an angle is right here. That's the vertex right there. So the vertex is, where those angles meet. That's a kind of a point. You don't actually have to draw a point, but the vertex is where an angle begins, or where the rays kind of intersect each other, stuff like that. But that's where vertical angles get their name, from the vertex. They share a vertex. They're directly across from each other. They have the same measurement. So I would say that, like, angle T, right here, angle T is vertical from angle B. They're both. Angle X is vertical from 50 degrees. Even though that doesn't have anything to do with up and down, they share this vertex and they're directly across from each other, and they have the same measurement. Adjacent angles are more about like what they share. So an adjacent angle are angles that share vertex, just like vertical angles, but they're not across from each other. Vertical angles are basically next to each other. That's how a lot of people will describe them. They're angles that are next to each other, but they share a ray. That's a better way to kind of think of it. So I would say, I'll just kind of, like this angle right here shares the ray that's right here. They share that ray, and they're right next to each other. And then you could tell by that, they don't have the same measure, but they're right next to each other. Sometimes you can call them a linear pair, but they share that vertex right there. They share the vertex. So T, you could say that T is adjacent to X. X is adjacent to T. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that X is vertical, X is adjacent to T. We can also say that T is adjacent to 50 degrees. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. You can go either way. But those angles are just as much next to each other as T is to X. So T is adjacent to 50, and T is adjacent to X as well. So those are next to each other because they share, like I said, they share this ray. This thing that comes out of the vertex is called a ray. That thing that jets out from the vertex, that's called a ray. They share that ray, and they share this vertex as well. All right, for the next examples here, I want you guys to, again, don't use your protractor. I want you to use what we know now about angles and the relationship of those angles to each other. Let's figure out all these missing angles right here. So the first one that we have to find is X. So X, you'll notice, is right across from 50 degrees. And I already said this earlier, but you might have forgot. But X is what relationship to 50? Those are vertical. Those are vertical angles. So if X is vertical from 50 and that's 50 degrees, well, so is X, because vertical angles we know are equal. Okay, now let's find T next. Now T, if you look at T, T is adjacent to X. More importantly, you'll notice that T and X are supplementary. So those are definitely supplementary to each other. They share a vertex and they share a ray. And if they're supplementary, that means they add up to 180. So if you just do 180 minus 50, you're going to get angle T, which is 130. So that goes right there. So T is 130. And then this kind of everything kind of dominoes from one angle to another. And so if T is 130, well, so is B, because those are vertical angles, relationship-wise to each other. So that's 130. Some things that sometimes people notice this. They'll notice that all four of those angles add up to 360, and a circle has 360 degrees. So for example, 12, we're going to find X. That's all we got to do. For this problem right here, these angles are vertical from each other. So we just have to set up a simple equation. 2x equals 16. And we're just going to solve for x on that one, meaning we're going to divide by 2 on both sides. So you got x equals 8. Now that doesn't mean 8 degrees, it just means x is equal to 8. So if I do 2 times 8, well, that's 16. So that's 16 degrees, obviously. But the exercise here was to figure out what x was. Okay, so that does it for this lesson. Hopefully you guys understand what the difference is between supplementary and complementary angles. Hopefully you understand what vertical angles are, what the relationship are to each other, and adjacent. So that does it. Everyone have a great day, and see you next time around.